The lightning flash revealed Samuel's worst nightmare, his beloved horse spirit plunging into the abandoned well with a bone-chilling scream that pierced the storm's roar. Without a moment's hesitation, the 72-year-old farmer made a vow that would test the limits of human endurance. Not a single morsel would pass his lips until his faithful companion was rescued, even if it meant following Spirit into darkness. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment on where you're watching from. Let's get started. The first drops of rain fell like whispers against the weathered roof of Samuel's barn, a gentle warning of the storm to come. Samuel Morgan paused from his work, raising his eyes to the darkening sky. At 62, his body carried the weight of decades working this land, but his eyes still held the sharp clarity of a man who'd spent his life reading the moods of the sky. This wasn't going to be an ordinary storm. "Come on, Spirit," he called, his voice carrying across the field where his beloved horse grazed peacefully, unaware of the brewing tempest. "Time to come in, boy." Spirit was no ordinary horse. Standing 17 hands high with a coat the color of burnished copper that seemed to glow even in the dimmest light, he'd been Samuel's companion for nearly 15 years. They'd weathered life's hardships together since Samuel's wife Eleanor passed away, leaving the old farmer to face his remaining years alone on the family ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations. Spirit's ears perked up at the sound of his master's voice, and he trotted obediently toward the barn, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his shining coat. The bond between them was something visitors to the Morgan farm often commented on: how the horse seemed to understand Samuel's words, how they moved together with a synchronicity that spoke of years of trust and companionship. "That's it, boy," Samuel said, patting Spirit's neck as the horse reached him. "Storm's coming, looks like a bad one." As if in confirmation, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the valley. Spirit's ears flicked nervously, but Samuel's calming hand kept him steady. Together they walked toward the barn, the old man and his faithful friend, silhouettes against the rapidly darkening landscape. Inside the barn, Samuel busied himself securing windows and checking that the roof wouldn't leak. The last major storm had damaged the eastern corner, and though he'd repaired it, he wasn't sure if his handiwork would hold against the fury building in the sky outside. His joints ached more these days, making repairs slower, more difficult. Each passing season reminded him of his age, of how much harder it was becoming to maintain the farm alone. "Just you and me, Spirit," he murmured, more to himself than to the horse. "We'll ride this one out together like always." By nightfall, the storm had transformed from threatening to ferocious. Rain lashed against the barn in sheets, driven by winds that howled through the valley like hungry wolves. Samuel had decided to stay in the barn with Spirit, partly to make sure the building held together, but mostly because the horse grew anxious during such violent storms. The company they provided each other was mutual comfort against nature's fury. Samuel sat on a wooden stool, an old lantern casting warm light across the hay-strewn floor. Spirit stood nearby, occasionally nudging Samuel's shoulder with his muzzle, as if checking that his human was still there. Outside, the storm raged, lightning splitting the sky in blinding flashes, followed by thunder that shook the very foundations of the barn. "Never seen a storm like this in all my years," Samuel told Spirit, scratching behind the horse's ears. "Your grandpa built this barn solid, though. We're safe in here." As the night wore on, Samuel dozed fitfully, awakened by particularly loud crashes of thunder. During one such moment, he noticed Spirit pacing restlessly, ears laid back, eyes showing the whites. Something had spooked him beyond just the storm. "What is it, boy?" Samuel stood, his old bones protesting the movement after hours on the hard stool. He approached Spirit, speaking in soothing tones. "It's just the storm. Nothing to..." His words were cut short by a cracking sound from above, distinct even above the howling wind. Samuel looked up just as a section of the roof gave way, rain pouring in through the new opening. Spirit reared in panic, nearly knocking Samuel over. "Whoa! Easy, boy." Samuel grabbed for Spirit's halter, but the horse was beyond calming. With the strength of fear, Spirit bolted toward the barn doors that rattled violently in the wind. Before Samuel could reach him, the doors burst open, thrown wide by a powerful gust. Spirit charged out into the storm-ravaged night. "Spirit, no!" Samuel shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the tempest. He rushed to the doorway, rain immediately soaking him to the skin. Lightning illuminated the yard in strobes, and he caught glimpses of Spirit galloping away, heading toward the western field. Without hesitation, Samuel grabbed a raincoat and flashlight and set out after his horse. The rain was blinding, the wind so strong it nearly knocked him off his feet. But the thought of Spirit out alone in this maelstrom drove him forward. "Spirit," he called repeatedly, knowing his voice couldn't possibly carry over the storm's roar. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as he struggled across the muddy ground, occasionally illuminating the deep puddles that had formed in the lowest parts of the field. The western field was dangerous in good weather, pockmarked with sinkholes and an old well that Samuel had covered years ago. In this storm, with the ground saturated and visibility near zero, it was treacherous. Samuel knew this, but fear for Spirit pushed rational thought aside. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief, brilliant moment, Samuel saw Spirit standing near the center of the field. Relief flooded through him, only to be instantly replaced by horror as he realized where exactly the horse was standing. Directly over the old well, its wooden cover likely weakened by years of weather and neglect. "Spirit, don't move," Samuel shouted, breaking into a run despite the slick mud and driving rain. But it was too late. In the next flash of lightning, he saw the ground give way beneath Spirit's hooves. The horse's terrified whinny pierced through the storm as he disappeared from sight, falling into the darkness below. "No!" Samuel's cry tore from his throat as he reached the spot where Spirit had stood just moments before. The flashlight beam revealed a gaping hole in the earth, the old well cover completely collapsed. From below came the sounds of splashing and frightened whinnying. Samuel dropped to his knees at the edge of the well, pointing his flashlight down into the darkness. The beam caught Spirit thrashing in water that had risen halfway up the well's depth. The horse's eyes were wide with panic, his efforts to find footing growing more desperate by the second. "I'm here, boy. I'm here," Samuel called down, trying to project calm he didn't feel. "Stay still. Please stay still." But Spirit continued to struggle, each movement risking injury in the confined space. Samuel knew he had to act quickly. The well was at least 20 feet deep, with smooth stone sides offering no easy way out. The rising water from the storm made the situation even more dire. If it continued to fill at this rate, Spirit would drown long before morning came. Samuel looked around desperately, searching for anything that might help. The farm was large, and his nearest neighbor lived miles away. In this storm, with the phone lines likely down, he was completely alone. Whatever he did to save Spirit, he would have to do it himself. "Hold on, boy," he whispered, a prayer carried away by the howling wind. "Just hold on. I'm not leaving you down there." With determination born of deep love, Samuel rose to his feet. Despite the pounding rain, despite his age and the impossibility of the task before him, one thought burned clearly in his mind. He would not let Spirit die alone in the darkness. Whatever it took, however long it took, he would find a way to bring his faithful friend back to safety. As lightning split the sky once more, illuminating Samuel's rain-soaked figure standing resolute beside the well, the first chapter in their desperate fight for survival had begun. Samuel raced back to the barn, his aging legs finding strength he hadn't known in years. The rain continued to pound mercilessly, turning the ground into a treacherous quagmire that threatened to pull him down with each desperate step. Twice he fell, mud caking his clothes, but each time he pushed himself up with a single thought burning in his mind. Spirit needed him. Inside the barn, Samuel frantically searched for anything that might help. His hands, gnarled from decades of farm work, trembled as he gathered rope, blankets, and a large tarp. He found his old mining headlamp, a relic from his younger days when he'd worked summer jobs in the coal mines to help his father keep the farm. It still worked, casting a weak yellow glow that seemed pathetically inadequate against the night's overwhelming darkness. "Hold on, Spirit," he muttered as he worked, as if his voice could somehow reach down into the well and comfort his trapped friend. "I'm coming for you." The journey back to the well felt longer, each step weighted with the supplies he carried and the fear that grew with every passing minute. Would the water rise too quickly? Would Spirit injure himself in panic? These thoughts drove Samuel forward through the storm that showed no signs of abating. When he reached the well again, Samuel dropped to his knees and shined his flashlight down. Spirit was still there, still alive, but the water had risen noticeably in the short time he'd been gone. The horse's frightened whinnies had quieted to occasional distressed snorts as if he were conserving energy. This was both a relief and a concern. Spirit was calmer, but the resignation in his posture suggested he was tiring. "I'm here, boy," Samuel called down, and at the sound of his voice, Spirit's ears perked up. The horse looked upward, eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. The silent plea in those eyes nearly broke Samuel's heart. Working quickly, Samuel anchored one end of the rope to his tractor, which stood nearby at the field's edge where he'd been using it the day before. He tied secure knots, testing each one with pulls that made his arthritic hands burn with pain. He couldn't afford mistakes. Spirit's life depended on it. Samuel fashioned a makeshift harness from the rope, creating loops and supports that he hoped would hold a horse's weight. He'd helped rescue livestock before, a cow from a muddy embankment, a neighbor's horse that had become trapped in a cattle guard, but never from a situation this dire, never alone. With the harness ready, Samuel faced his next challenge, getting it around Spirit. The well opening was barely wide enough for the horse, much less a man as well, but there was no choice. He would have to lower himself down. Samuel secured a second rope around his own waist, tying it to a different part of the tractor. With shaking hands, he fashioned a crude pulley system using a sturdy branch in the tractor's frame. The rain continued to pour, making every surface slick, every movement dangerous. "Lord, give me strength," he whispered, his first prayer in years, as he prepared to lower himself into the darkness. The descent was perilous. The well's stone walls, smoothed by years of water and weather, offered few handholds. Samuel's old joints screamed in protest as he braced his feet against the sides, slowly inching downward toward Spirit. The cold water soon reached his boots, then his knees, sending painful shivers through his body. But he kept going. When he finally reached Spirit, the water was chest-deep on the standing horse. Samuel placed a gentle hand on the animal's neck, feeling the tremors that ran through his powerful body. "Easy, boy. Easy now," he soothed, struggling to keep his own teeth from chattering as the cold water sapped his warmth and strength. "I'm going to get you out of here." Spirit seemed to recognize him despite the darkness and the strange environment, leaning his head against Samuel's shoulder in a gesture of trust that strengthened the old man's resolve. With numbed fingers, Samuel began working the rope harness around Spirit's body, talking continuously in low, reassuring tones. "There you go. That's a good boy. We've been through worse than this, haven't we? Remember that blizzard 5 winters back? We survived that, and we'll survive this too." It was a lie, and perhaps they both knew it. They'd never faced anything like this. But the words helped Samuel focus, helped Spirit remain calm as the harness was secured. Once the ropes were in place, Samuel faced the daunting task of climbing back up. His strength was fading, the cold water having stolen much of his energy. Twice he slipped, hanging by one hand as he struggled to find purchase on the slick walls. By the time he reached the top, pulling himself over the edge with the last of his strength, Samuel was exhausted. He lay on the muddy ground for precious moments, gasping for breath, his entire body trembling. But there was no time to rest. The storm continued unabated, and water was still flowing into the well. With monumental effort, Samuel dragged himself to the tractor. The vintage machine had been his father's pride, maintained meticulously through the years. Now it would face perhaps its greatest test. Samuel climbed into the seat, turned the key, and sent up another silent prayer as the engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. Carefully, so carefully, he engaged the power takeoff, which he'd connected to his makeshift pulley system. The rope went taut, and from the well came sounds of movement, of rope creaking under strain, of water splashing as Spirit was gradually lifted. The process was agonizingly slow. Samuel had to constantly adjust, stop, restart, making sure the ropes didn't tangle or slip. Each inch Spirit rose from the well felt like a miracle, each moment without the ropes breaking a blessing. "Come on, old girl," Samuel urged the tractor, patting its worn dashboard as the engine strained against the heavy load. "Just a little more." After what seemed like hours but was perhaps only 40 minutes, Spirit's head appeared at the well's edge. The horse's eyes were wide with fear, his breathing labored. Samuel cut the tractor's engine and rushed to help guide Spirit as the animal struggled to find footing on the slippery ground surrounding the well. With a final heave, Spirit pulled himself out, the rope harness holding just long enough before several strands snapped from the strain. The horse collapsed onto the muddy ground, sides heaving, legs splayed awkwardly. Samuel fell to his knees beside his friend, hands running over Spirit's body, checking for injuries. In the dim light of his headlamp, he could see cuts and scrapes where Spirit had struck the well's walls, but nothing seemed broken, a small mercy in their ongoing ordeal. "You did it, boy," Samuel whispered, pressing his forehead against Spirit's mud-caked neck. "You did it." But their fight was far from over. The storm still howled around them, and they were both soaked to the bone, exhausted, and far from shelter. Spirit's legs trembled as Samuel urged him to stand, the horse's usually proud bearing now humbled by fatigue and pain. Samuel looked toward the distant lights of his farmhouse, barely visible through the curtain of rain. It might as well have been miles away for how impossible the journey seemed in their current state. Yet they had no choice. To stay in the open during such a storm meant certain death. With gentle urging and supporting hands, Samuel helped Spirit take the first shaky steps toward home, each movement a testament to their shared will to survive. "Together," Samuel said, his voice nearly lost in the storm's fury. "We go together or not at all." And so they began their slow journey across the flooded field, man and horse leaning on each other, neither willing to surrender to the elements that seemed determined to claim them both before the night was through. The journey back to the farmhouse was a battle against both nature and their own failing bodies. Each step through the mud seemed to pull at them like hands from the grave, eager to claim them. Samuel's bones ached with a deep, penetrating cold that made every movement an exercise in willpower. Beside him, Spirit limped forward, his proud gait now reduced to a pained shuffle, his head hanging low against the driving rain. Lightning continued to flash overhead, illuminating their slow progress in stark white tableaus. An old man and his injured horse, two silhouettes against the raging elements, moving with the stubborn determination of creatures who refuse to surrender. "Just a little further," Samuel encouraged, though he could barely see the farmhouse lights through the sheets of rain. His voice was hoarse from shouting into the storm, but he kept talking, knowing that his words were a lifeline for both of them. "We're almost there, Spirit, almost home." The ground beneath them had become treacherous. What were once familiar fields were now transformed into a landscape of hidden dangers. Deep puddles, debris carried by water running off the hills, sinkholes forming where none had existed before. Twice more Spirit stumbled, nearly going down, and each time Samuel somehow found the strength to brace against the horse's massive weight, steadying him. When they finally reached the farmhouse yard, Samuel almost wept with relief. The journey that normally took minutes had stretched into what felt like hours. Spirit's breathing had become labored, each exhale producing small clouds in the cold air. The horse's legs trembled continuously now, and Samuel feared they might give out entirely before they reached shelter. The old barn where they'd started the evening was too far, its roof partially collapsed from the storm. Instead, Samuel guided Spirit toward the small shed attached to the rear of the farmhouse. It wasn't ideal, barely large enough for the horse to turn around in, but it was dry and would block the wind. "In here, boy," Samuel coaxed, pulling open the wooden door that groaned against the force of the wind. "Let's get you warm." Spirit hesitated at the threshold, as if sensing the confined space would trap him again. Samuel stroked the horse's neck, murmuring reassurances until finally, with cautious steps, Spirit entered the shed. Samuel quickly followed, pulling the door closed behind them. The sudden absence of rain beating against his face was disorienting, the relative quiet almost as shocking as the storm's roar had been. In the dim light filtering through the shed's single small window, Samuel assessed Spirit's condition, and his heart sank. The horse was in worse shape than he'd initially thought. Cuts and scrapes covered Spirit's legs and flanks, some still seeping blood that mixed with mud and water to create dark rivulets down his once gleaming coat. His breathing remained labored, and a fine tremor ran continuously through his powerful body. "Oh, Spirit," Samuel whispered, running his hands gently over the worst of the wounds. "What have I done to you?" The guilt crashed over him like another storm. He should have secured the well properly years ago, should have repaired the barn roof before the storm season, should have done 100 things differently that might have prevented this night's disaster. Now his beloved companion was suffering for his negligence, but self-recrimination wouldn't help Spirit now. Samuel pushed aside his guilt and focused on what needed to be done. First, they both needed to get dry and warm. He found old horse blankets stored in a trunk and used them to begin drying Spirit, working methodically from the horse's head down his neck and body. The familiar routine seemed to calm Spirit, whose breathing gradually became more regular under Samuel's ministrations. "That's it," Samuel encouraged, his voice softening as he worked. "You're going to be fine. We both are." He wasn't sure if he believed his own words. His hands were so numb he could barely feel the blanket, and a bone-deep chill had settled into his body. He needed to get inside, change into dry clothes, warm himself by the fire. But he couldn't bring himself to leave Spirit. Not yet. Not while the horse still trembled from cold and pain. Samuel continued working, using the last dry blanket to create a makeshift tent over Spirit's back, trapping what little body heat remained. Only when he'd done everything possible did he reluctantly prepare to head into the main house. "I'll be right back," he promised, patting Spirit's neck. "Don't you worry." The short walk from the shed to the back door of the farmhouse might as well have been a trek across Antarctica. The storm had intensified again, the wind cutting through Samuel's wet clothes like knives of ice. By the time he stumbled through the door into his kitchen, he could no longer feel his extremities, and his vision had begun to narrow alarmingly. With fumbling hands, he managed to light the stove and set a kettle to boil. He needed to raise his core temperature quickly. As the kitchen slowly filled with warmth, Samuel peeled off his sodden clothes, letting them fall in a heap on the floor. He found a blanket in the living room and wrapped it around himself, then returned to the kitchen where he prepared a hot drink with trembling hands. The liquid burned going down. But Samuel welcomed the pain. It meant he could still feel that the cold hadn't taken him completely. As warmth gradually returned to his body, so did the ability to think clearly. Spirit needed medical attention, attention Samuel wasn't qualified to provide. The nearest veterinarian, Dr. Walker, lived in town, a good 20 miles away. In this weather, with the roads likely flooded in places, it was an impossible journey. Samuel would have to do what he could on his own, at least until morning. If morning came, if the storm passed, if they both survived the night. He gathered supplies, the first aid kit from the bathroom, antiseptic, bandages, painkillers meant for humans but which might help Spirit in small doses. He found more blankets, towels, a bucket to carry clean water. Each item went into a large plastic tub that would keep everything dry during the dash back to the shed. Before leaving the warmth of the house, Samuel changed into the driest clothes he could find and pulled on his heavy winter coat. He filled a thermos with hot coffee, knowing the night ahead would be long and that he couldn't afford to fall asleep. Spirit would need constant monitoring. The journey back to the shed was as brutal as before, the storm giving no quarter. Samuel clutched the plastic tub to his chest, bent nearly double against the wind that seemed determined to tear it from his grasp. When he finally reached the shed door, he was gasping for breath, his recently recovered warmth already seeping away. Inside, Spirit stood where Samuel had left him, but something had changed. The horse's eyes, usually so bright and alert, now had a dull, distant quality that sent fear coursing through Samuel's veins. He'd seen that look before, in animals that had given up, that had decided the fight was too much, the pain too great. "No," Samuel said firmly, setting down his supplies and moving to stand before Spirit. Don't you dare give up on me now." He took the horse's massive head in his hands, forcing those dulled eyes to meet his own. "We've come too far, you and I. We didn't fight our way out of that well just to surrender now. You hear me, Spirit? We're not done fighting." Whether it was the tone of Samuel's voice or some understanding that passed between them, something changed in Spirit's gaze. A flicker of the old fire returned, and the horse gave a soft nicker, pushing his muzzle against Samuel's chest in a gesture so familiar, so normal, that tears sprang to the old man's eyes. "That's it," he whispered, wrapping his arms around Spirit's neck in a brief, fierce embrace. "That's my boy." With renewed determination, Samuel turned to his supplies. The night stretched before them, full of uncertainty and danger. But they would face it together as they had faced everything in the 15 years since Spirit had come into his life. And together, Samuel vowed silently, they would see the morning. The night stretched endlessly as Samuel worked tirelessly to care for Spirit. Outside, the storm continued its assault, rain hammering against the shed's roof like impatient fingers, wind finding every crack and crevice to send chilling drafts across their sanctuary. Samuel had hung the battery-powered lantern from a ceiling hook, its yellow glow creating a small circle of warmth in the darkness that enveloped them. With methodical patience, Samuel cleaned each of Spirit's wounds, starting with the worst, a deep gash on the horse's right foreleg that would likely need stitches. For now, all he could do was clean it thoroughly and apply pressure until the bleeding slowed. Spirit flinched as the antiseptic made contact with raw flesh, but he remained surprisingly still, as if understanding the necessity of the pain. "Good boy," Samuel murmured, his voice a constant stream of reassurance as he worked. "I know it hurts, I know, but we've got to get you cleaned up." His own body protested every movement. His back spasmed occasionally, a sharp reminder of the strain he'd put it through during the rescue. His hands, never fully recovered from the cold, fumbled with bandages and antiseptic bottles. But Samuel pushed through, focused entirely on Spirit's needs rather than his own discomfort. As he worked, Samuel's mind wandered to memories of when Spirit first came to the farm. The horse had been just 4 years old then, a wedding gift from Eleanor's brother who bred horses in Kentucky. Eleanor had fallen in love with the copper-colored colt instantly, naming him Spirit for his lively temperament and the white blaze on his forehead that resembled a flame. "Eleanor would have my hide if she saw you like this," Samuel told Spirit, carefully wrapping a clean bandage around the leg wound. "She always said I didn't take good enough care of you. Guess she was right." Spirit nickered softly, as if contradicting him, and nudged Samuel's shoulder with his muzzle. "Yeah, I know," Samuel smiled faintly. "You're too loyal for your own good." The work was slow, interrupted frequently when Samuel had to stop and warm his hands or when Spirit needed a moment to rest. After nearly 2 hours, Samuel had cleaned and dressed the worst of the wounds. Spirit's coat was still damp in places, but the worst of the mud and grime had been brushed away. Samuel opened the thermos and took a long sip of coffee, grateful for the warmth that spread through his chest. His watch showed just past midnight. The storm would likely continue until dawn, trapping them in this limbo of waiting and worrying. "You should eat something," Samuel said to Spirit, realizing he had nothing to offer the horse. The shed contained old tools, gardening supplies, and various household items in storage, but no feed. "I'll have to go back to the house. Get you some water, too." But when Samuel tried to stand, his legs buckled beneath him, sending him crashing to the floor of the shed. The pain that shot through his hip was so intense it momentarily blinded him, leaving him gasping on the cold concrete. Spirit immediately responded, moving closer, lowering his head to nose at Samuel with obvious concern. The horse's warm breath against his face brought Samuel back from the edge of panic. "I'm all right," he wheezed, though it was plainly a lie. "Just need a minute." With gritted teeth, Samuel pulled himself to a sitting position, leaning against the shed wall. The pain in his hip radiated outward, a burning sensation that suggested he'd done more than just bruise it. Years ago, he'd broken that same hip in a fall from a hayloft. The doctors had put it back together with pins and plates, warning him that another serious injury could be permanently disabling. "Not now," Samuel muttered, massaging the area gingerly. "Please, not now." Spirit stood over him, a silent sentinel, unwilling to move away despite his own injuries. Samuel reached up to stroke the horse's muzzle, drawing comfort from the warm, velvety touch. "We're a pair, aren't we?" he said softly, "both too stubborn to know when we're beat." After several minutes, Samuel attempted to stand again, this time using the wall for support. His hip protested violently, but he managed to get upright, breathing heavily from the effort. He wouldn't be making any quick trips back to the house, that much was clear. Every step would be an ordeal. But Spirit needed water, and without it, the horse's condition would deteriorate rapidly. Dehydration after such an ordeal could be fatal. Samuel had no choice but to try. "I'll be back," he promised Spirit, steeling himself for the journey. "You rest." The few steps to the shed door felt like miles. Samuel's breath came in short, painful gasps as he fought to keep weight off his injured hip. When he finally reached the door and pulled it open, the full force of the storm hit him like a physical blow, nearly knocking him backward. The rain was coming down in solid sheets now, turning the yard into what looked like a shallow lake. Lightning flashed continuously, providing brief, surreal glimpses of a landscape transformed into something alien and hostile. The wind howled with renewed fury, bending trees until they seemed in danger of snapping. Samuel stared out into the maelstrom, his heart sinking. In his current condition, he'd never make it to the house and back. He might not even make it across the yard. If he fell out there, in the mud and rain, he might not be able to get up again. And then what would happen to Spirit? With a heavy heart, Samuel closed the door against the storm. He turned back to Spirit, who watched him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand everything. "I can't make it, boy," Samuel admitted, the words catching in his throat. "I'm sorry. We'll have to wait out the storm." Samuel made his way back to Spirit's side, each step a lesson in endurance. When he reached the horse, he leaned against his warm bulk, drawing strength from the solid presence. Together, they would have to weather this night with what they had. No food, no fresh water, just each other's company and the shelter of the small shed. As the hours crept by, Samuel drifted in and out of consciousness, his body finally succumbing to exhaustion despite his best efforts to stay awake. Each time he jerked back to awareness, he found Spirit standing patiently beside him, keeping vigil in his own way. During one such moment of clarity, Samuel noticed that Spirit's breathing had become more labored, a raspy sound accompanying each exhale. The horse's eyes, when they met Samuel's, held a glassy quality that sent a spike of fear through the old farmer's heart. "No, no, no!" Samuel struggled to his feet, ignoring the screaming pain in his hip. He ran his hands over Spirit's body, finding what he'd dreaded. The horse's skin felt hot to the touch, far warmer than it should be. Fever had set in, likely from infection in one of the wounds. Without antibiotics, without proper veterinary care, fever could kill a horse as surely as any physical injury. Samuel had seen it happen before, had lost animals to infection despite his best efforts. The thought of losing Spirit this way, after everything they'd survived already, was unbearable. "Fight it," Samuel urged, pressing his forehead against Spirit's neck. "You hear me? You've got to fight." Outside, the storm continued unabated, trapping them in their small haven that increasingly felt like a prison. Morning seemed impossibly distant, a promise too fragile to trust. For now, there was only the night, the pain, and the quiet struggle of two souls determined to see another dawn together. Samuel looked into Spirit's eyes, seeing his own fear reflected there, but also something else, a resilience that transcended their dire circumstances. They had survived this far against impossible odds. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could hold on a little longer. "We're not done yet," Samuel whispered, as much to himself as to Spirit. "Not by a long shot." Dawn seemed an impossible dream as the hours crawled by. The storm, rather than abating, appeared to have found new strength, as if determined to test the limits of both man and horse, trapped in their fragile shelter. Samuel had lost track of time, his watch face now impossible to read in the dim light as the lantern's battery weakened, casting ever fainter shadows across the shed walls. Spirit's condition had worsened. The fever burned through his powerful body, making his coat alternately damp with sweat and shivering with chills. Samuel had used the last of the clean water from his thermos to wet a cloth and place it across Spirit's neck in a futile attempt to cool him. It wasn't enough. Nothing he had was enough. But Samuel couldn't bear to do nothing while his friend suffered. "Stay with me," Samuel urged, his voice rough from hours of talking. He hadn't stopped speaking to Spirit, believing that his words might be the tether keeping the horse from slipping away. "The storm can't last forever. Morning will come. Dr. Walker will come." But even as he spoke the reassurances, doubt gnawed at him. His hip had swollen to the point where movement was almost impossible. The pain had settled into a constant throbbing presence, like some malevolent creature that had taken up residence in his body. Each time he shifted position, even slightly, white-hot daggers seemed to pierce his joint, leaving him gasping and lightheaded. Together they created a tableau of quiet suffering, the horse standing with head low, sides heaving with labored breaths, the old man leaning against him, one hand always in contact with Spirit's coat, as if that connection alone kept them both alive. "Remember when Eleanor was still with us?" Samuel said, needing to fill the silence that pressed in around them like another presence in the small space. "How she used to bring you apples every morning. You'd hear her coming and start nickering before she even reached the barn. Spirit's ear twitched, perhaps responding to the sound of Samuel's voice, perhaps remembering the woman who had loved him as much as Samuel did. She always said you were the most handsome horse in the county. She used to brag about you to anyone who'd listen. Samuel smiled at the memory, though the expression felt foreign on his face after so many hours of worry. She was right, of course, always was. A violent gust of wind rattled the shed door, making both Samuel and Spirit start. For a moment, Samuel feared the entire structure might come apart around them, leaving them exposed to the elements' fury. But the old shed held, its weathered boards creaking in protest, but standing firm against the onslaught. "Built this shed with my father when I was just a boy," Samuel told Spirit, patting the rough wooden wall. "He knew how to build things to last, not like the junk they sell nowadays." The reminiscing helped, creating a bubble of normalcy in their dire situation. Samuel continued, pulling up memories from the recesses of his mind, stories of the farm's early days, of his childhood adventures, of Eleanor and the life they'd built together. Spirit listened, or seemed to, his breathing occasionally synchronizing with the rhythm of Samuel's words. As Samuel talked, he became aware of a subtle change in the shed's atmosphere. The darkness outside the windows seemed less absolute, the blackness softening to a deep charcoal gray. With a surge of hope, Samuel realized that dawn was approaching. They had made it through the night. "Look, Spirit," he said, gesturing weakly toward the window. "Morning's coming." But Spirit didn't respond. The horse stood motionless, eyes half closed, his breathing shallow and irregular. The fever had taken a greater toll than Samuel had realized, sapping Spirit's strength to the point where even staying upright seemed to require monumental effort. "No," Samuel whispered, panic rising in his chest. "No, no, no, don't you give up now. We're almost there." With an effort that sent fresh waves of agony through his hip, Samuel pushed himself to his feet. He needed to get help immediately. The approaching dawn meant the storm might be weakening, that the roads might soon be passable. If he could just reach the house, call Dr. Walker. But as Samuel reached for the door handle, his injured hip finally betrayed him completely. His leg buckled, sending him crashing to the floor with a cry that tore from his throat before he could stop it. The pain was blinding, all-consuming, driving every other thought from his mind. For several moments, he could only lie there, fighting to remain conscious as waves of nausea threatened to overwhelm him. When the worst of the pain subsided enough for awareness to return, Samuel found himself staring at the shed's dirt floor, his cheek pressed against the cool earth. He tried to move, to push himself up, but his body refused to cooperate. The fall had done more damage, perhaps dislocating the already injured hip, and now even the slightest movement sent fresh torment shooting through his entire lower body. "Spirit," he called, his voice barely audible even to his own ears. "Spirit, I need you." From somewhere above and behind him came the sound of movement, the shuffling of hooves, a soft snort. Despite his condition, despite the fever that ravaged him, Spirit had heard Samuel's call and was responding. Samuel felt warm breath on the back of his neck, then the gentle pressure of Spirit's muzzle nudging his shoulder. The horse was trying to help him up, using the only means available to him. "Good boy," Samuel whispered, tears springing to his eyes at this display of loyalty. "But I can't get up, not this time." Spirit nickered softly. Then, to Samuel's astonishment, the horse carefully lowered himself to the ground beside his fallen master. It was an awkward process, Spirit's injuries and weakened state making the normally simple action difficult and clearly painful. But the horse persisted, finally managing to lie down on the shed floor, his body curled protectively around Samuel's. The warmth of Spirit's body against his own was immediately comforting, a shield against the cold that had seeped into Samuel's bones. Spirit's neck stretched out alongside Samuel, his head coming to rest near Samuel's chest, where the old man could reach up with trembling fingers to stroke the velvety muzzle. "Thank you," Samuel murmured, overcome with emotion at this final act of companionship. They were both down now, both unable to rise, both at the mercy of fate and whatever the new day might bring. But they were together, as they had been for 15 years, sharing warmth, sharing breath, sharing life for as long as it remained to them. Outside, the first true light of dawn began to filter through the storm clouds, casting weak, watery beams across the flooded landscape. The rain had finally begun to slacken, the wind's howl diminishing to an occasional moan. The storm was passing, but for the two beings huddled together in the small shed, the danger had not. Samuel's thoughts began to drift, consciousness slipping away despite his efforts to stay awake. He needed to remain alert, to keep watch over Spirit, but his body had reached its limits. As darkness encroached on the edges of his vision, Samuel's hand remained on Spirit's neck, maintaining that vital connection even as awareness faded. His last coherent thought before unconsciousness claimed him was a fervent hope that someone would come looking for them soon. Not for his sake. It was too late for him, he sensed that now. But for Spirit. The horse deserved a chance to live, to recover, to run again across the fields they both loved so dearly. "Hold on," Samuel whispered, the words barely a breath against Spirit's coat. "Just hold on." And then darkness took him, sweeping away pain and fear and conscious thought, leaving only the sound of two hearts beating in tandem, growing steadily weaker as the new day dawned over the storm-ravaged farm. Mike Reynolds had been Samuel Morgan's nearest neighbor for over 20 years, though near was a relative term in this sparsely populated farming community. Their properties were separated by 2 miles of rolling hills and a small creek that often swelled during heavy rains. They weren't close friends. Both men valued their privacy too much for that. But there existed between them the quiet understanding of those who have worked the land side by side for decades. When Mike hadn't seen smoke rising from Samuel's chimney for 2 days following the worst storm in recent memory, concern began to gnaw at him. Samuel was getting on in years after all, and lived alone since Eleanor's passing. The old farmer was fiercely independent, but even the most self-reliant person could find themselves in trouble after a storm like the one that had just passed through. "I'm just going to drive over and check on the old coot," Mike told his wife as he pulled on his rubber boots. "Probably nothing, but better safe than sorry." The roads were still partially flooded, mud and debris making the journey treacherous even in Mike's sturdy pickup truck. Several times he had to detour around fallen trees or sections of road washed out by the torrential rains. What should have been a 10-minute drive stretched into nearly 45 minutes of careful navigation and muttered curses. When Mike finally turned onto the long driveway leading to Samuel's farmhouse, he immediately sensed something was wrong. There were no lights visible in the windows despite the gloomy, overcast morning. Samuel's tractor sat oddly positioned at the edge of the western field, far from its usual spot in the equipment shed. And strangest of all, there was no sign of Spirit, Samuel's beloved horse, who was typically visible grazing in one of the front pastures. Mike parked his truck in the muddy yard and approached the house, calling out Samuel's name. Silence answered him. The front door was locked, unusual for country folk who rarely saw the need for such precautions. Mike peered through windows, seeing nothing amiss inside, just the ordinary interior of a simple farmhouse, looking as if its owner had simply stepped out for a moment. But Samuel's old truck was still parked beside the barn, which itself showed significant damage from the storm. Part of the roof had collapsed inward, explaining why Spirit wasn't in his usual stall. "Samuel!" Mike called again, louder this time, his voice carrying across the sodden fields. "You out here, old man?" Nothing. Mike made a complete circuit of the house, checking outbuildings as he went. When he reached the small shed attached to the rear of the farmhouse, he noticed something odd, muddy boot prints leading to the door, far more than would be normal for casual use of the storage space. "Samuel?" Mike called, knocking firmly on the wooden door. "You in there?" A faint sound reached his ears, not human, but the weak nickering of a horse. Mike's heart jumped into his throat. With renewed urgency, he tried the door handle and found it unlocked. The door swung open to reveal a scene that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Samuel lay motionless on the dirt floor, his body curled against Spirit, who had collapsed beside him. Both man and horse appeared in terrible condition. Samuel's face was ashen, his breathing shallow and irregular, while Spirit's coat was matted with dried blood and mud, his powerful body trembling with obvious fever. "Jesus Christ," Mike breathed, dropping to his knees beside Samuel. He pressed his fingers to the old man's neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, but weak and thready. Samuel's skin felt cold and clammy to the touch, his lips tinged with blue. "Samuel, can you hear me?" Mike patted his friend's cheek firmly, trying to elicit some response. Samuel's eyelids fluttered but didn't open, a low moan escaping his lips. Spirit, seemingly roused by the newcomer's voice, lifted his head slightly, eyes rolling to focus on Mike. The horse made another weak, nickering sound, as if pleading for help not for himself, but for his master. Mike didn't waste time wondering what had happened. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed 911, relieved to see he had at least one bar of service despite the remote location. "I need an ambulance at the Morgan farm, end of Old Mill Road," he said the moment the dispatcher answered. "Elderly man unconscious, appears severely injured and hypothermic." He provided additional details as requested, then added, "And we need a large animal vet too. There's a horse in bad shape here as well." While waiting for emergency services, Mike did what he could for both Samuel and Spirit. He found blankets in the house and covered Samuel carefully, wary of moving him too much in case of spinal injuries. For Spirit, he brought water from the kitchen, holding a bowl to the horse's muzzle so he could drink small sips. Throughout these ministrations, Mike talked continuously, addressing both Samuel and Spirit in turn, hoping his voice might provide some comfort or connection to these two beings who had clearly been through hell together. "Help's coming," he assured them repeatedly. "Just hang on a little longer. Both of you, just hang on." Spirit seemed to understand, his eyes following Mike's movements with a kind of desperate hope. The horse made no attempt to rise, but remained pressed against Samuel, as if unwilling to surrender his self-appointed duty as protector, even in his own dire condition. The wait for emergency services seemed interminable. Mike paced the small confines of the shed, occasionally checking Samuel's pulse, offering more water to Spirit, and peering out the door for any sign of approaching vehicles. The isolation that country dwellers usually cherished became a curse in emergencies like this, where every minute might mean the difference between life and death. Finally, the distant wail of sirens pierced the morning quiet. Mike rushed outside to flag down the ambulance, directing them to the shed. The paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, gently moving Spirit aside enough to access Samuel properly. The horse resisted at first, until Mike stroked his neck and murmured reassurances. The horse protected him, Mike explained to the puzzled paramedics as they assessed Samuel's condition. "Kept him warm through the night, I'd guess. They must have been out in that storm somehow." "Well, the horse probably saved his life," one paramedic responded, placing an oxygen mask over Samuel's face. "His core temperature is dangerously low. If he'd been alone..." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. As they prepared to transport Samuel to the hospital, the veterinarian arrived, Dr. Walker, who had tended to the animals in this county for nearly 30 years. The stocky, silver-haired woman took one look at Spirit, and her normally cheerful face turned grave. "What happened here?" she asked Mike, already opening her medical bag. Don't know exactly, Mike admitted. Found them like this. Samuel unconscious, the horse looking half dead but still trying to protect him. Dr. Walker knelt beside Spirit, running expert hands over the horse's body, examining the makeshift bandages Samuel had applied, taking the animal's temperature. Her frown deepened as her assessment continued. "He's in bad shape," she finally said. "Multiple lacerations, probable internal injuries, and a high fever indicating infection. But," she paused, her hand resting on Spirit's neck, "he's strong, and he clearly has something to live for." She nodded toward Samuel, who was being carefully loaded onto a stretcher by the paramedics. Even in his unconscious state, the old man's hand seemed to reach out as if seeking the reassuring presence of his four-legged friend. "Will they make it?" Mike asked quietly, looking from the horse to his human companion. Dr. Walker met his gaze steadily. "I can't make promises, but I'll tell you this. I've seen miracles happen when there's a bond like theirs. Sometimes it's enough to pull them both through." As the ambulance doors closed on Samuel and Dr. Walker began emergency treatment for Spirit, Mike Reynolds stood in the muddy farmyard, witness to a story of survival and devotion he could scarcely comprehend, but would never forget. White light, antiseptic smell, beeping machines. These were Samuel's first impressions as consciousness gradually returned, pulling him from the dark void where he'd been floating. His eyes, heavy and uncooperative, struggled to focus on the unfamiliar ceiling above him. His mouth felt dry as cotton, his thoughts disjointed and hazy. Hospital. He was in a hospital. The realization came slowly, along with fragmented memories of the storm, the well, Spirit. Spirit. Samuel tried to sit up, a surge of panic giving him momentary strength, but pain immediately lanced through his hip and down his leg, forcing a groan from his parched lips. Almost instantly, a nurse appeared at his bedside, her face professionally concerned as she gently pressed him back against the pillows. "Easy now, Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You're not going anywhere just yet." "My horse," Samuel rasped, his voice barely recognizable even to his own ears. "Spirit, where is he? Is he alive?" The nurse adjusted his IV line, checking the monitors before answering. "I don't know about any horse, sir. You were brought in alone, in pretty bad shape. You've been unconscious for nearly 2 days. 2 days," the words hit Samuel like a physical blow. 2 days of lying here, useless, while Spirit might be suffering or already gone. The thought was unbearable. "I need to know," Samuel insisted, his voice cracking. "Please. He was with me in the shed. He was sick, injured." Something in his desperation must have reached the nurse. Her expression softened slightly. "Let me see what I can find out. Your neighbor, Mr. Reynolds, has been checking in on you. He might know something." She left, and Samuel was again alone with his thoughts and fears. The room swam in and out of focus as he fought against the medication that pulled at his consciousness. He couldn't sleep, not until he knew. Some indeterminate time later, minutes or hours, Samuel couldn't tell, the door opened again. This time it was Mike Reynolds who entered, his weathered face creased with concern and relief. "You gave us all one hell of a scare, old man," Mike said by way of greeting, pulling a chair close to the bed. "Spirit," Samuel said immediately, ignoring the pleasantry. "Tell me." Mike's expression grew serious but not grave, a distinction that sent a flicker of hope through Samuel's chest. "He's alive," Mike confirmed, and Samuel felt a weight lift from his heart, allowing him to breathe properly for the first time since waking. "But he's in rough shape, Samuel. Dr. Walker's been treating him at your place. Said it was too risky to move him at first." "How bad?" Samuel asked, needing the unvarnished truth. Mike sighed, rubbing a hand across his stubbled chin. "Bad enough. Infection in some of those cuts he got. Fever that wouldn't break for the first day. Dehydration, exhaustion. But Dr. Walker says he's responding to the antibiotics now. Started eating a little yesterday. Samuel closed his eyes briefly, offering a silent prayer of thanks. I need to see him. Mike snorted. You're not seeing anyone except doctors for a while from what they tell me. Dislocated hip with complications from your old injury, hypothermia, exhaustion. You're 72, Samuel, not 17. You nearly died out there. Wouldn't have made it at all if not for Spirit, Samuel said quietly, memories of those dark hours in the shed flooding back. The warmth of Spirit's body against his own when he could no longer stand. The steady rhythm of the horse's breathing that had somehow kept Samuel's own lungs working through the night. Yeah, that's what Dr. Walker figured. Mike nodded. Said the horse probably kept you warm enough to survive until I found you. Never seen anything like it, Samuel. That animal wouldn't leave your side even when they were loading you into the ambulance. Took Dr. Walker and me both to convince him to let them take you. Samuel wasn't surprised. The bond between them had always been extraordinary, something visitors to the farm often commented on. Eleanor had called it a soul connection, two beings who somehow recognized each other across the divide of species. Samuel had always thought her fanciful, but now he wondered if she'd been right all along. Will he recover? Samuel asked, the question that mattered most. Mike hesitated just long enough for Samuel to feel fear clutch at his heart again. Dr. Walker isn't making promises. Says the next few days are critical. But she also says he's fighting hard, like he's got something to come back for. Someone to come back for, Samuel thought. Just as he had something, someone, to recover for. They were each other's reason to keep fighting. I need to get out of here, Samuel said, determination hardening his voice. Spirit needs me. Spirit needs you alive and healing, Mike countered firmly. Best thing you can do for that horse right now is follow doctor's orders and get better. You're no good to him half dead. The logic was irrefutable, but it did nothing to ease the ache in Samuel's chest, the desperate need to be with Spirit during his struggle. As if sensing his thoughts, Mike's expression softened. Look, I've been checking on him twice a day. Martha from the Jensen farm has been helping with his care. You know she used to work as a vet tech, and Dr. Walker's stopping by every evening. Spirit's not alone, Samuel. The knowledge provided some comfort, but it wasn't enough. Samuel needed to be there, needed Spirit to know he hadn't been abandoned. Can you bring him a shirt or something of mine? Samuel asked suddenly. Something with my scent on it, so he knows I'm coming back. Mike looked surprised for a moment, then nodded slowly in understanding. Yeah, I can do that. I'll grab something from your house today. And talk to him, Samuel added. Tell him I'm all right, that I'm coming home as soon as I can. Mike's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. You want me to have a conversation with your horse? He understands more than you'd think, Samuel insisted, too concerned about Spirit to care if he sounded foolish. All right, Mike held up his hands in surrender. I'll tell him. Anything else while I'm playing messenger between you two? Despite everything, the pain, the worry, the frustration of confinement, Samuel felt a small smile form. Yeah. Tell him to mind his manners for Dr. Walker. He can be stubborn about taking medicine. Mike shook his head, but there was fondness in the gesture. You two deserve each other, you know that? Both stubborn as mules. He stood, patting Samuel's arm gently. I'll come back tomorrow with an update. You focus on getting better. After Mike left, Samuel turned his gaze to the window, where weak sunlight filtered through half-drawn blinds. Somewhere out there, miles away, Spirit was fighting his own battle for survival. The distance between them felt intolerable, a physical ache worse than his injured hip. "Hold on, Spirit," Samuel whispered to the empty room. "I'm coming home. You just hold on." In the days that followed, Samuel became the model patient, following every instruction, performing every painful rehabilitation exercise without complaint. His single-minded focus on recovery impressed even the most jaded hospital staff. What they didn't understand was that every bend of his healing hip, every shuffling step with the walker, brought him one moment closer to returning to Spirit. Mike visited daily, bringing updates that Samuel clung to like lifelines. Spirit was eating better. Spirit had stood for nearly an hour yesterday. The fever was finally gone. Dr. Walker was cautiously optimistic, and though Mike would never admit it, he had indeed been talking to the horse, telling him about Samuel's progress, promising his return. Sometimes, Mike swore, Spirit seemed to nod in understanding, his eyes fixed on the flannel shirt of Samuel's that now hung on a nail near his stall. 2 weeks passed with excruciating slowness, each day a test of Samuel's patience and determination. The doctors were impressed with his progress. "Remarkable for a man your age," they kept saying, a phrase that Samuel found both encouraging and irritating. He wasn't recovering quickly because of some inherent vitality that defied his years. He was recovering because every moment in this hospital was a moment away from Spirit, and that was simply unacceptable. On the 17th day, Dr. Patel, the orthopedic specialist who had been overseeing Samuel's care, entered his room with a thoughtful expression. Samuel had learned to read the doctor's subtle cues, and this particular look could mean either very good or very bad news. "Well, Mr. Morgan," Dr. Patel began, consulting the chart in his hands, "your latest X-rays show significant improvement. The hip is healing well, though I must caution you that complete recovery will still take months, not weeks." "But," Samuel prompted, sensing there was more. Dr. Patel smiled slightly. "But with certain provisions, I believe you could continue your recovery at home, rather than being transferred to a rehabilitation facility as we originally discussed." Home. The word resonated in Samuel's chest like a struck bell. Home to his farm, his land, home to Spirit. "What kind of provisions?" Samuel asked, already mentally preparing to agree to anything that would get him out of this sterile room with its antiseptic smell and endless beeping machines. "You would need in-home assistance, at least initially. Someone to help with daily tasks, monitor your medication, assist with your physical therapy exercises. You live alone, I understand?" Samuel nodded. "But my neighbor, Mike Reynolds, has been checking on my property, and there's a community nursing service in town. I used them briefly when my wife was ill." Dr. Patel considered this information. "That could work. You would also need to use a wheelchair for longer distances, at least for the first few weeks. No driving, no lifting anything heavier than a coffee cup, and absolutely no farm work." The restrictions chafed, but Samuel would have agreed to far more stringent conditions. "When can I leave?" "If we can arrange the home care by tomorrow, you could be discharged the day after." "But Mr. Morgan," Dr. Patel's expression grew serious, "I need your word that you'll follow these restrictions. Your recovery has been impressive, but it's also fragile. One wrong move could undo all the progress you've made, possibly permanently." "You have my word," Samuel said solemnly, and meant it. He wouldn't risk a permanent disability, not when Spirit needed him, not just now, but for years to come. True to Dr. Patel's timeline, Samuel found himself being wheeled out of the hospital 2 days later, Mike's pickup truck waiting at the curb. The process of getting Samuel settled in the passenger seat was awkward and painful despite the nurse's experienced assistance, but Samuel endured it without complaint. Each twinge was a reminder that he was going home, one step closer to Spirit. The drive seemed both endless and too short, Samuel eager to arrive yet apprehensive about what he would find. Mike had continued his daily updates, reporting that Spirit was recovering steadily, But Samuel needed to see for himself, to touch and smell and hear his friend, to know in his bones that Spirit was truly healing. When they finally turned onto the long driveway leading to the farmhouse, Samuel leaned forward in his seat, eyes searching hungrily for any sign of his horse. The farm looked different than he remembered, parts of fields still waterlogged from the storm, the damaged barn roof covered with a blue tarp, trees showing broken limbs like wounded soldiers. But it was home, still standing despite nature's best efforts to reclaim it. "Where is he?" Samuel asked, unable to see Spirit in any of the pastures. Dr. Walker thought it best to keep him in the small paddock behind the house, Mike explained, driving slowly to minimize jostling Samuel's hip. Easier to monitor him that way, and keeps him from trying to do too much too soon. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Samuel ignored the gentle jab. "Is he outside now?" Mike nodded. "Martha turned him out about an hour ago. Said he's been restless all morning, like he knew something was happening today." The thought warmed Samuel's heart. Perhaps Spirit had sensed his impending return, the same way he'd always seemed to know when Samuel was approaching the barn, nickering a greeting before the old farmer was even visible. Mike parked as close to the house as possible, then helped Samuel with the complex process of getting from the truck to the wheelchair that the hospital had provided. By the time Samuel was settled, sweat beaded his forehead from the effort and pain, but his eyes remained fixed on the path that led around the side of the house to the paddock. "Take me to him," Samuel said, his voice a mixture of command and plea. Mike complied without comment, pushing the wheelchair carefully over the uneven ground. As they rounded the corner of the house, the paddock came into view, and there was Spirit, standing alert at the fence, ears pricked forward, head high in a posture Samuel hadn't seen since before the storm. The horse's coat still lacked its usual shine, and even from a distance, Samuel could see the healing wounds and patches of hair that had been shaved for treatment. Spirit was thinner, his once muscular frame showing the effects of his ordeal. But he was alive, standing strong, and watching their approach with unmistakable recognition. When Spirit caught sight of Samuel, his reaction was immediate and profound. The horse let out a loud whinny that seemed to contain all the emotion of their separation, then began moving along the fence line, following their approach, his pace quickening with each step despite a noticeable limp. "Spirit," Samuel called, his voice breaking on the name. "I'm here, boy. I'm home." At the sound of Samuel's voice, Spirit tossed his head and nickered again, a sound so familiar and welcome that Samuel felt tears springing to his eyes. Mike pushed the wheelchair right up to the fence, then discreetly stepped back, giving man and horse their moment of reunion. Spirit stretched his neck over the fence, nostrils flaring as he took in Samuel's scent. Samuel reached up with trembling hands to touch the velvety muzzle he had feared he might never feel again. The connection, warm breath against his palm, soft hair beneath his fingers, sent a wave of emotion through him so powerful that the tears he'd been holding back finally spilled over. "I thought I'd lost you," Samuel whispered, stroking Spirit's face, noting every change, every mark left by their ordeal. "But you're too stubborn for that, aren't you?" Spirit nudged Samuel's shoulder gently, as if checking that he was real, then rested his head against the old man's chest in a gesture of such trust and affection that even Mike, watching from a respectful distance, had to clear his throat and look away. They remained like that for long minutes, re-establishing the connection that had been strained by separation, but never broken. Words weren't necessary between them, never had been. Their communication had always existed on a level beyond language, in the silent understanding that comes from years of shared experiences, mutual dependence, and unconditional love. When Samuel finally looked up, wiping moisture from his weathered cheeks without embarrassment, he found Dr. Walker standing beside Mike, her expression a mixture of professional satisfaction and genuine emotion. "He's been waiting for you," she said simply. "Wouldn't fully commit to getting better until today." Samuel nodded, understanding completely. They had both been holding part of themselves in reserve, waiting for reunion before fully embracing recovery. Now that wait was over. Now the real healing could begin, for both of them, together, as it was always meant to be. "We'll be all right now," Samuel said, as much to Spirit as to the humans present. "We've got each other. That's all we need." And as Spirit lifted his head to gaze at Samuel, with those intelligent eyes that had seen him through 15 years of joy and sorrow, Samuel knew with bone-deep certainty that his words were true. Whatever challenges lay ahead in their recovery, they would face them as they had faced the storm and its aftermath, together, drawing strength from a bond that even death had not been able to sever. The days following Samuel's return home fell into a rhythm, a dance of mutual healing that bound man and horse ever closer. Each morning began with Samuel being helped onto the porch by Martha Jensen, the visiting nurse who came daily to assist with his physical needs. From there, he could see Spirit in the paddock, and those first glimpses of his friend moving about in the early light became a medicine more potent than any pill the doctors had prescribed. Spirit, too, seemed to draw strength from Samuel's presence. Dr. Walker noted with professional curiosity how the horse's recovery accelerated after his owner's return, appetite improving, wounds healing cleanly, energy returning in visible increments with each passing day. "I've seen strong bonds between animals and owners before," she remarked to Samuel during one of her now weekly visits, "but this is something different. It's almost like you're healing each other." Samuel nodded, watching as Spirit tested his recovering legs with careful steps around the paddock. "That's exactly what we're doing, Doc. Always have." By the third week home, Samuel had graduated from the wheelchair to a walker, making slow but determined circuits of the porch, while Spirit watched attentively from his paddock. Sometimes, when Samuel reached the far end of the porch, momentarily out of sight, Spirit would nicker softly, as if checking that his human was still there. Samuel would always answer, his voice carrying reassurance across the short distance between them. "Still here, boy. Not going anywhere." Samuel's physical therapy exercises became a spectator event, with Spirit positioning himself at the fence line closest to the porch, ears forward, watching with what Samuel swore was encouragement as the old farmer struggled through repetitions designed to strengthen his damaged hip. "He's counting reps," Samuel told Mike one afternoon as his neighbor helped him through a particularly painful set of movements. "See how he nods after each one, keeping me honest." Mike rolled his eyes but didn't contradict him. The connection between man and horse had long since moved beyond anything he could rationalize or explain away. As Samuel's mobility improved, so too did Spirit's. The limp that had marked the horse's gait gradually faded, and his once matted coat began to regain its copper sheen under Martha's diligent grooming. The physical wounds healed faster than the emotional ones, however. Spirit remained skittish during thunderstorms, eyes rolling with fear at the sound of distant rumbles, and Samuel would sit with him for hours in the small shelter of the paddock, talking quietly, offering the comfort of his presence until the fear subsided. Samuel had his own nightmares, vivid dreams of dark water rising, of Spirit falling away from him into bottomless depths, of cold so intense it burned. He would wake gasping, disoriented, only finding peace when dawn came, and he could see Spirit safe in the paddock, solid and real and alive. They were changed, both of them, marked by their ordeal in ways both visible and invisible. But there was something else too, something gained rather than lost, a deepened appreciation for each moment together, each sunrise witnessed side by side, each breath drawn in the quiet company of the other. Nearly lost everything that night, Samuel confided to Mike one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Spirit graze peacefully in the golden light of sunset. Made me realize what matters. Mike nodded, understanding without needing elaboration. In their farming community, life's fragility was a lesson learned early and often, but sometimes it took a brush with death to truly illuminate the value of what remained. 6 weeks after returning home, Samuel reached a milestone he'd been anticipating with equal parts eagerness and apprehension. Dr. Patel, during his follow-up visit, finally gave permission for Samuel to attempt short walks beyond the confines of the house and porch, with the walker, with supervision, and with strict limitations on distance and duration. "I want to go to the paddock," Samuel said immediately. "I want to be with Spirit without a fence between us." Martha, who had grown fond of both patient and horse during her weeks of service, readily agreed to supervise this first venture. The journey from porch to paddock gate was only about 50 yards, but to Samuel, leaning heavily on his walker, each step requiring conscious effort and control, it might as well have been miles. Spirit watched his approach with unusual stillness, standing just inside the gate, ears pricked forward, eyes never leaving Samuel's laboring form. The horse seemed to understand the significance of this moment, the milestone it represented in their shared journey of recovery. When Samuel finally reached the gate, sweat dampening his shirt despite the mild temperature, Martha moved ahead to open it, then stepped back, instinctively recognizing that what came next was a private communion not meant for others' eyes. Samuel paused at the threshold, suddenly overwhelmed by emotion. This small patch of earth, this simple wooden gate, they had been the barrier between him and Spirit for weeks, a necessary separation during their most vulnerable healing. Crossing this boundary felt momentous, sacred even. With a deep breath, Samuel stepped into the paddock. Spirit remained motionless, allowing Samuel to make his way slowly across the short distance between them. When they were finally face to face, no fence between them for the first time since that terrible night, both man and horse seemed to exhale simultaneously, releasing a tension neither had fully acknowledged until this moment of liberation. "Hello, old friend," Samuel whispered, reaching up to stroke Spirit's face with hands that trembled not from weakness now but from emotion. "Been a long road, hasn't it?" Spirit lowered his head, pressing his forehead against Samuel's chest in a gesture of such gentleness and intimacy that Martha, watching from outside the fence, felt tears spring to her eyes. The horse seemed acutely aware of Samuel's fragility, adjusting his considerable strength to accommodate his human's current limitations. For nearly an hour, Samuel remained in the paddock with Spirit, sometimes talking softly, sometimes silent, their connection needing no words to sustain it. When he finally allowed Martha to help him back to the house, exhausted but exhilarated by the excursion, Samuel felt a peace settle over him that had been absent since the night of the storm. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold, Samuel sat on his porch and watched Spirit moving freely around his paddock, head high, steps confident, the picture of recovery well underway. The memory of that night, the fear, the pain, the desperate struggle to survive, would never fully fade. But neither would the knowledge of what they had discovered in those dark hours, the depth of their bond, the strength they could draw from each other, the simple miracle of two beings choosing to fight for life together rather than surrender alone. News of their ordeal and remarkable recovery had spread throughout the county, turning Samuel and Spirit into minor local celebrities. Visitors began arriving, first neighbors bearing casseroles and well wishes, then strangers who had heard the story and wanted to witness this exceptional partnership for themselves. Samuel accepted their attention with gracious humility, understanding that people needed stories of survival, of hope persisting against impossible odds. But in his heart he knew that what he and Spirit had endured wasn't extraordinary because they had survived. It was extraordinary because, faced with the ultimate darkness, They had chosen each other's welfare above their own, a choice that had somehow carried them both back into the light. As night fell and stars emerged above the farm, Samuel remained on the porch, unwilling yet to retreat indoors and lose sight of Spirit. From the paddock came the soft sounds of the horse settling for the night, a gentle snort, the rhythmic tearing of grass, the occasional shifting of hooves on packed earth. Ordinary sounds that now seemed miraculous to Samuel's ears. "Good night, Spirit," he called softly into the darkness, knowing the horse would hear him, would understand. "I'll see you in the morning." And in that simple promise of continued days together lay all the victory they needed over the storm that had nearly claimed them both. 1 year after the storm that had nearly claimed their lives, Samuel Morgan stood in the center of his newly rebuilt barn, morning sunlight streaming through the open doors to illuminate the fresh timber and gleaming hardware. The structure was stronger now, reinforced against future storms, with a roof that would withstand far more punishment than nature had dealt that fateful night. The old well in the western field had been properly filled and sealed, transformed from a deadly hazard to merely another slight depression in the rolling landscape of the farm. Samuel himself had been similarly transformed. At 73, he would never again have the strength or mobility of his younger years. His hip ached in cold weather, and he walked with a slight but permanent limp, relying on a handcrafted wooden cane that Mike had made for him during his recovery. Yet these limitations seemed insignificant compared to what might have been, what almost was. The sound of hoofbeats drew Samuel's attention to the barn entrance. Spirit appeared in the doorway, his copper coat gleaming in the sunlight, head held high, eyes bright with intelligence and life. The scars from his injuries were still visible if one knew where to look, a patch of hair that grew in a different direction on his flank, a slight unevenness to his gait when he was tired. But to casual observers, he appeared simply as a magnificent horse in his prime, showing little evidence of his brush with death. "There you are," Samuel said warmly, holding out his hand. Spirit approached without hesitation, nuzzling Samuel's palm in greeting. "Ready for our ride?" The question would have seemed impossible during those dark days of early recovery, when both man and horse had struggled simply to stand without assistance. But time, determination, and their unwavering connection had worked a kind of miracle that even Dr. Walker had admitted exceeded her most optimistic prognosis. Samuel led Spirit to the mounting block that had become necessary in his condition. Climbing onto the horse's back was still a challenge, requiring careful movements and occasionally sending twinges of pain through his damaged hip. But the moment he settled into the saddle, a sense of rightness, of wholeness washed over him. This was where he belonged, where they both belonged, together, moving as one across the land they called home. They set out at an easy pace, following the familiar trail that skirted the edge of the property. It was a perfect spring morning, the air fresh and sweet with new growth, birds calling from trees whose leaves had just unfurled in vibrant green. Samuel kept the reins loose, trusting Spirit to choose their path. The horse had developed an uncanny awareness of Samuel's physical limitations, adjusting his movements to minimize discomfort, slowing before turns, carefully picking his way over uneven ground. Their route took them past the western field, and as they approached, Samuel felt Spirit tense slightly beneath him. Even after a year, neither of them could pass this place without remembering. Samuel patted Spirit's neck reassuringly. "It's all right, boy. That's behind us now." Spirit's ears flicked back at the sound of Samuel's voice, then forward again as he continued past the field with measured steps. They had come here often during their recovery, facing the sight of their trauma together, rather than allowing it to become a source of fear. Each visit had been a small victory, a reclaiming of territory from painful memory. As they crested a small rise that offered a view of the entire farm, Samuel drew Spirit to a halt. From this vantage point, he could see the new barn, the farmhouse with its freshly painted shutters, the fields beginning to green with early crops. It was the same view he'd cherished for decades, yet he saw it now with different eyes. Eyes that recognized the fragility of all human endeavors, the temporary nature of what we build and claim as permanent. "We're lucky, Spirit," Samuel said quietly, as much to himself as to the horse. "Luckier than we had any right to be." The past year had brought changes beyond their physical recovery. Word of their story had spread, drawing unexpected attention to the small farm. A local newspaper had run a feature article, complete with photographs of Samuel and Spirit standing together in the rebuilt barn. Then a regional magazine had picked up the story, focusing on the remarkable bond between man and horse that had enabled their survival against overwhelming odds. Visitors had become common, families bringing children to meet the horse who had saved his owner's life, elderly neighbors drawing comfort from a tale of resilience that mirrored their own struggles, even a group of therapy horse handlers seeking insights into the healing connection between humans and equines. Samuel had initially found the attention discomforting, but gradually came to accept it as yet another unexpected outcome of that terrible night. If their story brought hope or inspiration to others, perhaps that was part of the purpose behind their survival. Dr. Walker had perhaps summarized it best during her final professional visit, when she had officially pronounced Spirit fully recovered. "What you two have," she'd said, watching Samuel and Spirit moving in perfect tandem across the paddock. "It's rare. I've worked with animals my whole life, and I've never seen anything quite like it. You saved each other, and people need to hear about that. We all need reminders that we're stronger together than alone." Samuel turned Spirit toward home, letting the horse choose their path down the gentle slope. The morning ride had become their daily ritual, a celebration of recovery and continued life. Some days they ventured further than others, testing the increasing limits of their endurance, but they always moved as one being, the communication between them so subtle it was nearly imperceptible to observers. As they approached the barn, Samuel spotted Mike's truck pulling into the drive. His neighbor had become a more frequent visitor over the past year, their shared experience during the aftermath of the storm having deepened a friendship previously characterized by respectful distance. "Looks like we have company," Samuel told Spirit, who had already noticed the arrival and adjusted their course accordingly. By the time they reached the barnyard, Mike was waiting, a broad smile creasing his weathered face. "You two look good out there," he called in greeting. "Almost like you were never laid up at all." Samuel dismounted carefully, accepting Mike's steadying hand, with the grace of a man who had learned that independence and interdependence were not mutually exclusive. "Some days are better than others," he acknowledged. "But we can't complain, can we, Spirit?" The horse nudged Samuel's shoulder gently, then moved a few paces away to drink from the water trough, remaining within sight as always. "Got some news," Mike said, helping Samuel remove Spirit's saddle. "Remember that girl from the university who came out to interview you a few months back for her veterinary program?" Samuel nodded. The young woman had been earnest and thoughtful, asking insightful questions about his relationship with Spirit that had made him examine aspects of their bond he'd previously taken for granted. "Well, she called me this morning. Seems her professor wants to include your story in some kind of research study about animal-human connections and their role in healing. Asked if you'd be willing to participate." Samuel glanced at Spirit, who had finished drinking and now stood watching them, alert and interested as always in any conversation that involved him. "What do you think, boy? Ready to become a scientific case study?" Spirit tossed his head and nickered softly, a sound that Samuel had long ago learned to interpret as affirmation. "I'll take that as a yes," Samuel smiled, turning back to Mike. "Tell her we'd be honored. If our experience can help others understand what's possible between humans and animals, that's all to the good." As Mike departed with the message, Samuel led Spirit into the cool shade of the barn for a well-deserved rest. Standing in the peaceful quiet, his hand resting on Spirit's strong neck, Samuel felt a profound contentment that transcended the physical pain he still carried. Their ordeal had nearly broken them both, but in surviving it together, they had discovered a truth that now defined their days. Love in its purest form could pull beings back from the edge of darkness, could heal wounds both visible and hidden, could transform near tragedy into a life more richly lived than before. "Thank you," Samuel whispered to Spirit, words he had spoken countless times over the past year, yet never enough. The horse leaned gently against him in response, two survivors bound by a storm's fury and saved by a love stronger than death itself.